Okay, so yeah, welcome again to UTMIST Machine Learning Study Group's crash course workshop. So in this workshop, let me admit people in the waiting room. Yeah, sorry about that. It was showing unmuted on Zoom, but apparently on my headphones it was muted. Yeah. Hopefully it's all right now. Yeah, feel free to let me know in the chat if this happens again. Okay. Yeah, so welcome to our crash course workshop series. And so how we want to form these workshop is we want to start off with a problem that we want to tackle first, and then um, expand on the concepts and the tools involved in solving this problem. So just a different way of learning these concepts so that we can see it from more of an applied perspective. Last time we looked at digits classification, and this time we'll be looking at, I'd say, a pretty common image classification problem. So classifying flowers today. And then we'll be using convolutional neural networks, so CNNs, which is a pretty common architecture used in image classification. Yeah, so this problem would be what we'll be looking at today. Okay, so when I was thinking about the workshop topics, the reason why I chose this was I'm sure we've all been in scenarios where maybe we're taking a walk in the neighborhood or in parks and we see this really cool plant or flower and we want to know what it is, right? So then if it were maybe 10 or 15 years ago, it would have taken a lot of work to figure that out. But nowadays there are so in the example here, there are plant identification apps where you can just take a picture of the plant or the plant or the flower that you're interested in, and then it will immediately tell you what it is, which is quite cool, right? So that's why today we'll be looking at a similar problem, but in a smaller scale. So this way we can sort of understand potentially how some of these apps might be working in the back end. So how is it able to classify and learn these things? Yep. Yeah. Okay. So this is kind of similar to last time as well. So the steps that we'll be taking today. First, we'll start off with the data set. As always, the data set is a pretty important part because it's what we'll be using to learn. And then sometimes the data set might not be the most desirable shape for our problem. So a lot of the times, another very important step is data processing. So you will want to process the data in the best shape so that it's suitable for the model. And then our main character today is CNN, so we'll be learning about and taking a look at how CNN, what it is, right? So, and then how we can use it. So, and then, yeah, for the model, of course, there will be training involved, how we can train it to make the correct predictions. And finally, very quickly, we'll take a look at some of the ways we can test it and then evaluate how our model is doing. Is it doing good? Is it giving the right predictions and things like that? Yeah. So this is the steps we'll be going through today. So we'll start off with looking at the concepts first involved in these steps, and then at the end we'll do a quick demo to see some of the more details in how this all works. Yep. Okay, we're here again. So we'll start off with the data set. So this is in this workshop, it's a smaller scale problem. So of course it can't just in the app, of course, it can pretty much identify any type of plant or flower. That's very, very powerful. But today we'll be looking at just 5 types. So this data set will have these 3 types as shown here. And for each flower type, there'll be around 800 images of each. So yeah, as you can see here, of course we are able to recognize that, oh, this is a daisy, this is a dandelion. But if you just use a JPEG image, it might not be in the best form or shape. So machine models might not be able to take in this. So this leads us to our next slide. So we want to be able to represent these images as data instead. And images as data, images are essentially just a matrix of pixel values, as you can see here. So the pixel values are here. And if you have a common RGB image, so colored image, you would have 3 color channels for each color. So you can see like red, green, and blue for the different channels, and images are essentially just pixel values, and they're in the form of a matrix. So that's how it'll be presented. Okay, and now that you have the input images, we want to further process it as well so that it's ready to be used for our model. So we also have to, I've listed the things here. So first, we want to resize the image just so that they're consistent, right? We want to have consistent input images. So we'll be resizing them. So that's for the images. And then of course, since you're training the model, you have to have sort of an answer key of some sort, and those will be called the labels. So like you might have an image data like this, and you would also want to have a corresponding answer key for this. So this would be a tulip. And the way, of course, you can't just throw like daisy or dandelion in as the label. It might be a bit more sophisticated. So another way of representing these classes would be using one-hot encoding. So one-hot encoding, an example is shown here. You would have, since we have 5 classes, we would have sort of like 5 slots, and then the one would be in a different position each time. So this would be how you would be able to distinguish between the different classes and labels. Yeah, so we have the images and we have the labels. And in addition to that, we'll also have to split it into training and validation sets. So training would be used for training, hence its name. And then validation would be used to, again, validate or test to verify what we've trained. So so after we do these further processings, we now have the data in the correct shape, or yeah, the correct shape. So it'll be ready to be fed into the model. So that was for the data part. Now let's take a look at the CNN architecture. So this picture might seem a bit busy right now. It's got a lot of information, but don't worry, we'll go into more details about each particular step in the following slides. But this is just to give you a quick overview. So you have the input image. This should be in our case, it would be a flower image. And then I'd say it has 2 major steps here. So these ones are computations that you do to extract the key features in the image. So one of the reasons why CNN is very preferred for image classification is because of this. So if you just use any other neural network to classify images, it has a lot of pixel data, and that might be too overwhelming. So that's why this part is good, since we'll be extracting only the key features to, yeah, so then it will be kind of like extracting only the desired features and taking out the less useful features. And then, so after you've reduced it, you can further flatten it, and then now you'll be able to feed it into a separate, fully connected layers. So this is kind of similar to the MLP we talked about last time. So this is a different, it has different computations, and that will classify into different classes. So for us, this time it will be whether it's a daisy or dandelion, et cetera. Yeah, it will be able to classify those features. Yeah, so essentially what it does, it'll extract the key features and then classify those key features in the last part. Yeah, so this is the overview. Yeah, so now moving on to more of the specific steps, we can see there are convolution steps. So what it does, what convolution is, first of all, it's in the it's in the name, so it's a pretty important part of CNN. Its convolution is basically just in our case, it'll be a matrix multiplication between the kernel and the covered area of the image. And a kernel, which could also be called a filter sometimes, it's used in convolutional operation, as you can see here. And so this yellow part would be the kernel as it moves through the image. So the green part would be the image. And the kernel would have the same dimension as the channel size. What this means is, we mentioned before, for example, for RGB images, you have 3 channels. So accordingly, you would have to have 3 kernels for those 3 channels as well. But here we're just looking at the two-dimensional space. So you can see the kernel moves across the image and it performs matrix multiplication, and the output is shown here. So then you can see after you have this image before, and then you have this after, this convolved feature. So you can see the features, the key features have been extracted, and this would allow for easier processing. So this is the convolution, and there are also parameters that you can tweak. So for example, I've listed a few here. So you can control the stride. So you can see, like, as it moves along, it's taking one step at a time. But you can also change this setting to maybe take 3 strides at a time. So you can control the step size of each shift. And then also you can do padding to the image. So you can pad zeros around this image. So then it'll have more room for the kernel to move, and then that will affect the output dimension. So these are all ways you can control how you want the convolution to be like. And don't worry if this looks a bit complicated now. I'll share some, after these 2 slides, I'll share, I found these really nice animations in a few online articles. So I'll show them afterwards as well. And those should give a clearer picture of how this works. So those are for the convolution layers. There are also max pooling layers. which we'll look at in this slide. So what this does is, okay, what it does depends on the type. So you have different types. There are max pooling and there's also average pooling. And as you can tell from the name, for max pooling, you just get the max of the overlapping area. So this is kind of similar to this, but instead you are just taking the max or the average of the overlapping area. And why we want to do this is, as you can see, this is, so again, this is the input image, and what's being moved would be the overlapping parts. So the kernel, and then this is the output. So you can see we've reduced the spatial size, and because we're taking the max or the average, we're also extracting the dominant features. So this, and because of this, we'll be able to decrease the computational power, which is always nice because you don't want to consume too much power. So this is the pooling layer. So we've looked at this part. So now we have nicely extracted features. So, oh, actually, before I move on, let me just show the nice animations I was referring to. Yeah, so this is showing it more in a 3-dimensional form. So you can see this is in 2D, but oftentimes when you're dealing with, let's say, colored images, you would have a depth of 3, so 3 channels for 3 different colors. And as you perform the computation, it would sort of move like this. And you can see here as well, you have 3 channels for red, green, and blue, and that's why the kernel would also be in 3-dimensional, in 3 dimensions. So you would perform the computations accordingly for each channel and then get the output. So this would be what it looks like sort of in the 3-dimensional space. And then for the strides and padding, there are also some nice animations here as well. So if you have no padding and no strides, so this is just, so the blue is the input and the green is the output. This is just what we looked at before. And then you can also add some padding like this here. So you can see they've padded the input. So then now you have more space to move. So then that'll change how the convolution works. And let's see. Okay, here you're changing the stride. So you can see it's taking 2 steps at a time. And that's also changing the dimension of the output. Yeah, so you can see this is how some of the convolution scenarios could be like. Yeah. Is the kernel matrix fixed for every color? Oh, I see a question. The question is kernel matrix fixed for every color? Well, here it doesn't look like it is. So it looks like, to answer your question, it looks like the kernels, they have different kernels for each color channel. Yeah, I guess depending on the color, they might need to perform different computations since it's different colors. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Let me know if you have any other question. What's the advantage of different computations on colors? Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say I'm not sure about the precise answer for that, but intuitively, I'd say different colors, they're, of course, with the different colors, you see them differently, and they probably offer a different, they have different characteristics. So perhaps because of that, you want to perform different computations for that. It's like, since they're different, so maybe we want to deal with them in a different way. That's my take. Does that answer your questions? Okay, let me know if you have further questions, and we can discuss if we have more time at the end as well. Yeah, so that's convolution. And then let's move on to the fully connected layers. Okay, sorry, just taking a look at the questions. So some kernels can sharpen. Yeah, I'd say whole-wise operations. Yeah, looking at this example, I'd say yes. So it must be this kernel would be targeted towards the red channel, and this would be targeted towards green, and that would be targeted for the blue. So that's why they have separate kernels for the different channels. Yep. Okay. We can come back to this afterwards too if we have time. For now, let me move on. Yeah, so this part, it's, if you were here last time, it's kind of similar to what we did last time with MLPs, so multi-layered perceptrons. So this is just an ANN, so artificial neural network structure. It's often like this, and it has different neurons, as you can see. And how neurons work is, it's referenced from the biological neuron. So you take in inputs, and you also take in biases, and you do some sort of computation to get the output. And there is also a weight involved in the computation, and this weight will be what you'd be tuning in order to improve the prediction. And there are also activation functions that helps to activate that neuron. So if you just think about it in a higher level, it's sort of kind of just like a biological neuron when you're transmitting the information. And we've used it here to train the model in order to distinguish those features that we've extracted. Because we've done all those work to convert the data and then flatten the data. So now the data is in a more suitable shape to be classified by this neural network. Oh, actually, let me show this as well. There's also this really nice animation on TensorFlow on this. Yeah, this will probably give a better visual about how all this work. So in this one, you can see the neurons here. So they would be performing the computations. And so you have two layers here, and then you have the input. So the input data, you can see it's just, so blue and orange are two different types, and they're in a form like this. So that's the input data, and then the output is over here. So since we haven't trained it at all, you can see so the background color is the predictions. It's sort of random and it doesn't match the data. But if we train it, and actually before we train, so what's shown here is the output of the neuron. And then you can also see like these lines, they have different, well, now they kind of have different weights right now as well. So the thickness of these lines would be representing the weight, and the weight is a very key variable, I'd say, that you be tuning so that you would get better predictions. So if you train it a bit more, you can see it's the weight's changing, and because the weight is changing, the computation is also changing. And then you can see now the prediction is sort of getting close to the data. And then if you train a bit more, yeah, you can see like if you train more, it will tune the weight more, and then you would get a higher accuracy. And now you can see it's able to identify the boundary between these two classes. So that's how the MLP or ANN, a different this is sort of like a different kind of neural net. It's able to classify these features. Okay, I see another question. Are hidden layers always class activation functions? Yes, I think they should. Yeah, they should. From what I've seen, most hidden layers should have activation functions too, because they would help um, to control when the neuron would fire. So sort of like, yeah, what's shown here. So the activation functions, they're more of associated with the neurons. And of course, neurons compose the layers. So yeah, I think most layers should have activation functions. Yeah. Yeah, activation functions, it's actually, there's a lot more involved in it. I haven't went into a lot of the details here because of the time. But yeah, activation function is an important part of this. But just to give an overview, it's just controls how the neuron fires. Yeah, so that's the model structure that we've looked at. And to end off our flow, we'll also take a quick look at some of the techniques that might be involved in training. So in training these models, often a big problem is overfitting. And what overfitting is, you can see here in this image, it demonstrates the different fits. So the dots would be the data in this scenario. And when you're just training it, you might just be able to only fit a line to it, perhaps. And then as you train more, you'll be able to fit a more, so this is kind of like a parabola to it, which is a better fit. And then you train more and more, because you might think that if you train more, it'll be better, right? Like if you study more. Yeah, kind of similar to that. But a lot of the times, if we can't get the correct degree to train it on, you might have overfitting. So you can see like the lines, it's way too overfitted to the data. But oftentimes you just want an overall trend, because the data that you're training it on is only a small part of what's out there, right? Like we can't possibly take a picture of every flower in this world. So it should be able to learn and have some flexibility. So this is where regularization comes in. So it'll, what it does, it's a technique that will try to discourage learning a model that's too complex like this. This would be the desired shape. So for regularization, there's a lot of different techniques, but today we'll only be using the data augmentation technique, which is a pretty cool technique, I'd say. So an example would be, let's say your data is a cute dog like this. And what data augmentation does, well, it's in its name, but you basically try to augment the data. So you can rotate it, you can just take parts of it, you can flatten it. So basically manipulate the data in different forms. So now you can see we used to just have this one image data, but now we have 9 different forms of this data. So not only does it prevent overfitting, but it also gives us more data, and more data is always nice since you have more things to train on, right? Yeah, so this is one technique that we'll be using. And then just to end it off, the last step, so evaluating and testing, right? We want to, in any problem, we would want to be able to tell whether it's if our prediction is good, if the solution that we have fits the problem, right? And a pretty interesting way of evaluating, especially for classification problems, is this confusion matrix. I think you might have seen it already in different courses maybe, but it's essentially you have the prediction, so what your model predicts, and the answer, the true class, in different column and in different size, maybe that's the word to use. So one would be the column and the other would be the row. And you have, so in this is just a general example. So here they've put positive and negative, but in our case, it would have the different classes. So you'd have like dandelion, rose, the different classes here. And then if your prediction is it's supposed to be a positive and the answer was positive, then you'd have a true positive. That would be green, so that would be right. But if you have a negative, so maybe a different class, and the prediction is also a different class, then it will also be green. So these would be the right ones, but you would also have the wrong ones here. And one thing that I found really nice about this is that you can, by putting it in this form, you can see the relationship between the different classes, and maybe like one type tends to be misinterpreted into another type. So this would be a really nice way of um, taking a look at the relationships between the different predictions and the answers. Yeah, so that's one way of evaluating it. Okay. Let me take a look at the time.